Hi there, I'm Vincent Boss and I provide dating and self-improvement advice. And in today's podcast, we're going to be discussing signs breakup is permanent. I provide audio coaching for breakup recovery, trying to get an ex back, attracting someone new, and life coaching. Visit www.dateme.tips for more details. Please check your spam and junk folders if you are expecting an email from me. So now let's get back into today's podcast, and today we are discussing signs breakup is permanent. So if you have been dumped and want to try to get your ex back, you want to see signs that your ex has changed their mind. But what if they haven't? In today's podcast, I'll be discussing 3 signs that your breakup is permanent. So let's get straight into this, and point number 1 is you haven't changed. So at the time of a breakup, you were no longer a person that your ex wanted to grow and continue a relationship with. But that wasn't always the case. If we look right back to when you and your now ex first met, the sparks would have flown and you would have both seen something in one another but would have made you wanted to try and build a successful relationship. Now, what the elements were about to you that attracted your ex at the time are going to be various. They're going to be covering everything from physical attraction to your attitude, to the way you treat others, to your motivation, to your ambition. Every single element within you would have to have been considered, and in your ex's mind, you were the one. Now, sadly, right now, you are not the one. And one of the things we need to do when trying to get an ex back is really think back to the time of when we did attract our ex. How were we? What were we? What was happening in both of our lives at that time? Can you get back to the person that once attracted your ex? Now, if you can do this, if you can figure out what is different now compared to back then that is a great starting point. But it is not everything. Because what we need to consider is you need to be an improved version of the person they met. Now, you may have heard people say in other podcasts, or maybe people that you know, for instance, they might say things such as, you've got to go back to being that person that your ex fell in love with. And what I am saying is that is a good starting point, but it isn't where you need to be. You need to be beyond that, because that person was back then, and we are always growing. So we need to consider who you were at the time when you attracted your ex, but then we need to build upon that person, because in essence, what we can see here is that unfortunately, the path you chose beyond the initial attraction, unfortunately, has ultimately led to you being dumped. So we need to retrace our steps all of the way back to the point of where you attracted your ex, take those core elements, and then go on a new journey, a new path forward, a different path. And this ties in with point number 1 in today's podcast about signs the breakup is permanent. Because if you haven't changed, then you're going to be the person that your ex dumped forevermore. Right now, however you look at it, whether you believe your ex should have dumped you or not, they ended the relationship. And they ended the relationship because they lost romantic emotional attraction. They didn't believe that you two was right for one another moving forward. Now, it doesn't mean that they always felt that. Of course, that's not the case. You were once together. And as I said, there were times when you were very much in love. But right now, that's not the case. So if you don't change from a person they don't want to be with, then unfortunately, they're never going to want to be with you. So you need to change. You need to look back to the past, go back to that point, and then grow beyond. That will give you that best chance of success of one day re-attracting your ex. But if you don't change, if you stay the person you are now, unfortunately, they're never coming back. This is one of the clearest signs I can suggest to you that your breakup is permanent. If you're not willing to understand what you need to do, let alone start doing it, then your breakup is always going to remain as it is. Sadly, that is broken up. Now, you can get your ex back. Not everybody will. But you can do it in most instances if you improve as a person and use the other hints, tips and advice that I've given in other podcasts and maybe you want to speak to me one-on-one via my audio coaching service about your unique perspective, because your situation is going to be different somewhat to a generalized advice that I have to give across my podcast. But you see where I'm going here. If you don't change from a person that they dumped, you are always going to remain dumped. You might think you're perfect with one another. You might think you've got kids and you need to stick together for the children. But ultimately, your ex does not want to be with you right now. They're not feeling enough romantic emotional attraction. And unless you change, that is not going to change in their mind. You might think they're wrong, but they're not wrong. They can't be wrong on their own feelings. Their own feelings suggest they don't feel comfortable with you moving forward. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means they're not feeling it anymore. So if you want to get them back, you must change, you must grow, you must evolve. Now, whether or not that's right for you, whether or not you feel that is something you actually want to do, well, that's up to you. Sometimes people decide they don't want to do what they need to get their ex back because it's not truly them. And that's fine, but you can't expect them to want to be with you. If you feel that way, if you want to stay exactly as you are, then that's fine, but don't plan on trying to get your ex back. You're going to have to try and find a new romantic option. And if you've been dumped for specific reasons which were not attractive, the likelihood is that somebody new won't want to come into your life either. It's not impossible, but you have to look at things clearly. So my suggestion is always to improve, but if you want to try to get your ex back, consider going right back to the beginning. Understand how you attracted them originally, but then go on a different path forward. You can't be the person that got them into a relationship before, because that was possibly years ago. They've also grown, they've evolved, they've changed. Your original self is not going to attract them, but it's a good starting point, it's a good basis for you to grow and move forward on a new and different path. So now let's get into point number 2 and the second point of today's podcast. Please like this video if you're watching on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. And point number 2 is your ex gets married. Now listen, I'm never going to say never. I've heard some crazy situations via my audio coaching service, speaking to hundreds of people over many years, and nothing would ultimately surprise me. So I will always say, look, never say never, but we have to look at the likelihood. We have to look at the probability. And if you find out that your ex has got married to somebody new, the chances of you getting your ex back are very, very slim, to the point of where we could pretty much say it is a sign that your breakup is permanent. Again, I'm never going to say never. I've heard very random crazy stories, but these are very much in the minority. So if you find out that your ex is in a long-term relationship with somebody else, that's not a good sign, but there's always some level of hope. However, if and when you find out they get married to a new person, at that point, you really need to be thinking to yourself, there's no real chance of getting your ex back. Even though I've said very, very occasionally that 0.1% it might come off for, that's not going to help you. You need to be thinking it's over. In fact, you need to be thinking it's over from the off. Because if you don't, you're never going to be focusing on yourself, growing as a person, making new connections. Because if your ex is in your mindset and you think, well, I'll just wait around long enough and they'll come back, that's not going to help you. It's actually less likely to get them back than if you move forward with your life and date new people. Because that at least shows you are a dateable option and you would have been improving yourself. So you can't be sitting around ever. You can't be thinking, well, my ex might come back, so I'm not going to do anything. You can't do that ever. But if and when you find out your ex is in a serious relationship, and of course, that isn't a good sign, but if and when you find out they've actually got married to that person, you really need to be saying to yourself, this really is it. That is a sign as clear as you can be that 0.1% of people will get an ex back from that position. Okay? It's not likely. And if you find yourself in that position and you're really, really struggling, this is when you need to be trying to fully focus on you. You should be doing this anyway, like I said. But if it gets to that point, then that is a sign for you to really kind of kickstart a new portion of your life. Whether or not you want to speak with a local doctor, a local counsellor, you need to do what you need to do to get through these difficult times if you find yourself in such a position that you feel stuck and you feel unable to move forward. Now, maybe instead of a local doctor or counsellor, you would actually like to speak with me. I provide a one-on-one audio coaching service where we can speak about your unique, specific situation. As I said earlier, your specifics are going to be different to the generalized advice I have to give in my podcasts. And if you do want to speak one-on-one, then please go to my website, www.dateme.tips, for more information about how I can become your coach and your teammate via my audio coaching service. So now let's get into point number 3 and the final point of today's podcast about signs breakup is permanent. And point number 3 is your ex is long distance. Now this could be from 2 different positions. Position 1 is where your ex becomes long distance. And what that means is you were once very much together in person, quite possibly married. You were certainly living in the same town, if not living together, if not living together and married for many, many years. But since the breakup, your ex has become long distance. Now that is the first position we're going to speak about right now. That could be happening to anybody. Like I said, you could have been living together, but unfortunately you find out that your ex has since become long distance. That isn't a good sign. And similar to point number 2, nothing is definitive. Never say never, but it's not a good sign, and you pretty much should be saying to yourself, that's that, okay? Could they come back? Yes, it's technically possible. Are they likely to? No. If they've decided to make a fresh start many thousands of miles away, time zones away, countries away, that is not likely to be something which could be rectified. Yes, theoretically, they could be homesick, come back to your town a few years later, and who knows where you both are at that point, but you can't be waiting around. And if you find out your ex is in a different time zone, countries away, thousands of miles away, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to reconnect in any meaningful way, especially if you're not even in the same portion of the day where maybe you're in your afternoon and they're in the middle of the night. Okay, you're not even going to be likely to bump into each other online theoretically, or whatever it may be. It's just not something which is likely to work for you. Now, the other option about your ex's long distance is if they've always been long distance. Maybe you had a relationship which was long distance. Perhaps you met a few times. Maybe you never actually met, but you still saw it as a relationship. And unfortunately, this relationship has ended. Again, if this is your position, I would say your chance of success is sadly very, very slim. In fact, if this is the scenario where you've met very few times, if ever, and your ex has always been long distance, I would actually say that unfortunately is even less likely for you to reconnect, probably less than 0.1%. The reason I say this is because you've not had the context of living with one another. You haven't had that bond which can only be developed by living very close, if not together. It is very different to speaking on the phone every night. Now you might say, well, we spoke 3 hours a day every day, but it is not the same as living with one another. So if your ex used to live with you and now they're long distance, sadly, that's not a good sign. But if your ex was always long distance, then sadly, that is an even worse sign of you getting your ex back. Again, I'm never going to say never. Stranger things have happened. Anything's possible. But you need to be focusing, in my opinion, on local people. You need a relationship with somebody, but if they call you up and say, hey, I've got off work early, can you come round? You can say, yeah, I'll be with you in 25 minutes. Okay, that's the scenario that you're looking for. Now, of course, if your partner is living maybe an hour or 2 away, yes, that's something that can be worked through. But ideally, your own town, maybe an hour or so, but nothing really beyond that. If you have a relationship with somebody and they call you up and say, hey, I've got off work early, can you come round? And you say, yeah, I'll be right there. It's going to take me 8 hours. That is not something which can function well on a relationship level. I sadly see very few long-distance relationships working long-term. The only long-distance relationships that I see working long-term don't stay long-distance relationships. They evolve into short-distance relationships because one or both people move. And that is a huge, huge thing for people to do. And you can't just be doing it on a whim. You need to be, for instance, spending a lot of time with one another to be really making sure you feel comfortable and confident doing what is necessary. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just giving you the likelihood. We're looking today at signs the breakup is permanent. And if you're long distance now, whether or not you were always long distance or whether or not they've just become long distance, I sadly see it as very unlikely that you're going to get your ex back. I would never say never. I'm not telling you it's impossible, but I am saying it is sadly a sign that isn't good. And you need to be focusing on local people, making new connections with somebody that you can meet up at close, quick distance and time. This is something where you can have a functioning relationship, where you can be quite quickly meeting each other once, twice, 3 times a week, no problem at all. That is how a relationship can blossom. You might tell me that you've been speaking on the phone for 3 hours a day, but unfortunately it's not going to give you every element of being one-on-one with one another in person. It's just not the same. So you need to be trying to have a relationship where you can physically be with one another. And if your ex has now moved away, or if they've always been away, sadly, it's unlikely that you will get back together. Now, I just want to leave you with some hope and positivity, because today's podcast has been, unfortunately, about signs your breakup might be permanent. And that is to say that if you don't get your ex back, you can find somebody even better. And you might not believe me, but trust me, you can do it. Whatever you think about your ex, they're not perfect, they're a human being. They make mistakes, just as I do, just as you do. They certainly do as well. You can find somebody who has better traits than your ex. Whatever it is you like about them, you can improve upon them. And you do that by improving yourself first, focusing on making new connections in your local community and finding your forever happiness. If you believe that this podcast has helped you, then please consider buying me a coffee. The link to do so is in the description.